Hello, I'm Jason Lee. It's an honor to be back for Oktoberfest with the Orangeburgh German-Swiss Genealogical Society. Today I want to talk about DNA privacy, particularly in the context of doing DNA testing for family history. So I'll go ahead with that. Just letting you know that you can find me online at Facebook. I'm often in the AncestryDNA Matching Facebook group. That's where we obviously talk about AncestryDNA match results, but as resourceful researchers, we also talk about our experiences with 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, and GEDmatch. We have over 101,000 members in the AncestryDNA Matching Facebook group now. So any question that you might have, eventually someone will come along and give you a good answer. It probably will come along pretty quickly. We have a really enthusiastic group. I've been a genetic genealogist for about 8 years now. I did a little bit, dabbled as a child, but genetic genealogy really drew me back in, and I've been having a good time with that for many years now. My usual full disclosure statement essentially boils down to the fact that I do not benefit from the sale of any DNA test kits at any of the DNA testing matching companies, so I come to this with a very independent perspective. I'm going to talk about some of the concerns that come up in terms of privacy with DNA testing. So I want to emphasize from the beginning that I fully support and strongly recommend DNA testing for genetic genealogy. And I want to emphasize that I use GEDmatch regularly, almost every day. So in the context of talking about privacy concerns, I want to be sure that everybody knows that I really recommend these services. So moving on to issues of DNA privacy, I talked about this once before, a bit after the Golden State Killer case came back into the headlines in 2018. DNA privacy continues to be a topic of big discussions. I think it's simmered down a bit since 2018 when things really exploded, but it's still a big topic. So I'm going to cover the issue of DNA privacy again. I'm going to talk about some of the facts surrounding DNA privacy. I'm going to give you my opinions. There are a lot of other opinions out there. We have to approach this topic with some humility because ultimately the discussion boils down to opinions. Some people are comfortable with things that other people aren't comfortable with. I'll make my recommendations, but everybody has to decide for themselves. So again, the Golden State Killer case really grabbed a lot of attention in 2018, and there was a lot of fear out there, I think. This is a comment that I think was made partially in jest, but I think it does boil down two lines of thought pretty well. First of all, a lot of people were really happy that a terrible killer had been brought to justice, but at the same time, there were some concerns and there were some questions about this new technology and how powerful is it? What can it do? What should we be concerned about? So there was some relief and fear at the same time. I would say that if we fully explore this issue, we might uncover a few uncomfortable facts, but I think it's a good idea to look at all of that unflinchingly. And I think that if we dig into the issues, even if they're uncomfortable, in the long run, we'll feel better about all of this and we'll make better decisions. So in my opinion, even though there are some legitimate concerns and that we need to pay close attention to, DNA testing for family history and for ethnicity is very safe. So that's another point that I want to emphasize that I think echoes the points that I've already made. I think DNA testing ultimately does come down to some privacy trade-offs. You have to be aware of those trade-offs, comfortable with those trade-offs, and if you think about those things carefully, you won't be as likely to have a negative reaction to headlines. We can't possibly anticipate all of the ways that DNA testing technology might be used, but I think if we put a lot of thought into the possibilities, we'll be prepared for most of what comes in the future. There are risks that you can't control in terms of privacy compromises with DNA testing. So we just need to think about that. And at the same time, there are some risks that we can control. We can do some things to protect ourselves, and we need to take advantage of those opportunities. So we'll talk about steps that you can take to protect yourself. And I think one of the main things that I want to drive home in this discussion is that even though there are some risks, they're fairly small, and we need to put the risk in perspective. Life is certainly not risk-free, so we need to think about privacy risks and put those concerns into good perspective. In my own DNA testing journey, I did start off with several concerns, and I worked my way through those concerns before I did any testing. So some of the concerns included the possibility of uncovering family secrets. It's becoming fairly common now because the databases are so large. There's so many people out there who have tested. Secrets are being uncovered. Half-siblings are turning up. Close family members that weren't known are becoming known, and that's something to be prepared for. There are a lot of surprises out there. A lot of these surprises come close to home, and we have to be prepared for that possibility. So I prepared myself for that. I prepared myself for potential health scares. I started with 23andMe, and they provide health information. So I thought ahead about the possibility of unwanted health information or unexpected health information, and braced myself for that. I thought about potential discrimination, particularly as it relates to genetic predispositions. So you want to think about things like that. Think about the possibility that hackers can get into these databases potentially. I think most of these companies work really hard to protect us against that possibility, but there are no absolute guarantees. So even if everything's happening the way it's supposed to be happening, if everybody's really doing what they're supposed to be doing, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, there's a possibility that hackers can get into these systems and cause problems that nobody really expected. Law enforcement and involvement of other government agencies has grabbed a lot of attention. That seems to really get reporters excited, and so there are a lot of stories in the news that reflect these concerns, and so it gets a lot of attention. It's not as big of a concern for me personally, but different people have different opinions about how concerned we should be about that possibility. That's something that each person has to decide. And then one of the issues that I was not prepared for when I did my DNA testing was the possibility of sharing data with distant cousins. I was not aware that that was something that this kind of DNA testing offered, and so I was really completely unprepared to be getting messages from cousins saying, hey, we share DNA, let's do some research, let's find out what's going on. I was not expecting that, so I wasn't fully prepared, and I had to spend some time looking into that to know what to do. So that's how I got into it. Everybody will come with different priorities and different concerns, but that was my early experience. Ultimately, despite my concerns, and I think some of them were relatively big concerns, I decided that my curiosity outweighed my fears, and so I went ahead with the testing. And I think that's really the process, the basic process that we all have to go through. We want to think about the possibilities and make a decision as to whether our desire to know more, our desire to explore outweighs our fears or not. And then I think we saw a spike in fears and anxiety when there were big headlines about the Golden State Killer case. again, I think the fears and anxiety has started to taper off. It's been tapering off probably for a good while. We're 2 years down the road, so the shock and surprise that came with these headlines is starting to fade away. But I do think that we need to continue to prepare ourselves for big news, for unexpected possibilities. I think with the anxiety and fear that came after the Golden State Killer case, we can look back and see that there was probably inadequate preparation for this kind of unexpected news story. So going further back in time to the years leading up to 2018, we can look back at the arguments and discussions that people were having, and we can see how maybe many of us were somewhat unprepared. And one of the big questions, even before the Golden State Killer news stories bubbled up in 2018, there was a lot of discussion about whether genealogy tests could be used by law enforcement. And there were a lot of experts who were saying it wasn't possible. And that turned out to be wrong, of course. But I want to revisit some of those arguments and try to learn from what happened before things got really interesting. So one of the arguments was a chain of custody argument, and this is a quote from a fairly prominent genetic genealogist. It says, while it's possible that law enforcement agencies could potentially obtain your DNA results from a testing company, it's unlikely. There's no chain of custody for DNA test results from a commercial genetic genealogy company, meaning the law enforcement agency cannot reliably ascertain that the DNA came from you. So that was an often quoted and often paraphrased quote, and we know now that that didn't quite address the issue. Another argument was the CODIS argument, and this is another quote from another prominent genealogist. The markers we test for in genetic genealogy are not the same markers the police test for in law enforcement. As genealogists, we're looking for genetic evidence of how we are like other people, other family members who share common ancestors with us. So genetic genealogy tests look to identify common factors that help us to group people together. Those markers, those characteristics, aren't really useful to the police at all. What they're looking for, what is coded in the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, are the parts of the DNA that make us unlike other people and set us apart as individuals. So adding the genetic genealogy databases to the law enforcement databases would literally be adding apples to oranges, with a predictable result of fruit salad, not evidence useful in court. So again, another argument, well-reasoned, based on facts, but it really fell apart after the Golden State Killer case came out again. So partially correct, or at least technically correct, but largely irrelevant, very influential. I think these arguments gave people a sense of security, a sense of reassurance that they didn't have to worry about law enforcement involvement in genetic genealogy. For me, it's not really a worry at all, but for those who feel uncomfortable with the presence of investigators, law enforcement investigators within these databases, it was a sense of, it provided a sense of security. But with that false sense of security, I think there was a lot of panic when it turned out that the arguments really didn't apply and were essentially incorrect. So let's not forget these arguments. I'm not pointing out these arguments to say that the people making these arguments made a big mistake. I think they were doing the best they could with the information they had. We can't possibly anticipate all of the future applications of this technology. So really, I think the best we can do is to expect the unexpected and realize that we can't perfectly predict the future, and we have to know that things might unfold in very unexpected ways. So before I go any further, I want to do a quick science review. I want to talk about some terminology that will help us as we go forward. The genome is all of the genetic information needed to build and maintain an organism. So all of the DNA in each one of your cells, that's the genome. The human genome consists of approximately 3 billion DNA base pairs. These base pairs are the letters that spell out your genetic code. And that DNA, those 3 billion DNA base pairs, are packaged in 23 pairs of chromosomes. So you might think of them as being like 23 pairs of books containing together billions and billions of letters. And this is a picture of the human genome, the 23 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes from Wikipedia. And you might think of each one of these chromosomes as a skein of yarn. If you unravel a skein of yarn, or in this case, unravel a chromosome, you get a string of letters that spell out the genetic code. Now, the genetic DNA testing companies test what are called SNPs, SNPs, SNPs. SNPs are special letters of the genetic code that vary from person to person and from group to group. Most of the genetic code is exactly identical for all people everywhere in the world, but SNPs are special letters that give us our unique characteristics. And the DNA testing companies that we use for genealogy focus on the SNPs. There are roughly 10 million SNPs in the human genome, and again, that's out of 3 billion total letters in the code. So the SNPs represent only about 0.3% of the entire genome. So they're really a small fraction. Of those 10 million SNPs, the DNA testing companies that we use for genealogy focus only on about 600,000. So again, a fraction of a fraction. In fact, these SNPs that are tested comprise only about 0.0002% of the genome. It's a very important but tiny fraction. Matching SNPs reveal biological relationships and shared ancestry. So people who share many SNPs are more closely related, and that's how we work with our DNA matching information to draw conclusions. The number of SNPs tested in a first cousin comparison only involves 0.00005% of the genome. So again, a very tiny fraction. Sometimes it helps to visualize these numbers, and so I'm going to show some chromosome browser comparisons. This first one is a father-daughter comparison. So this is what 50% looks like. Parents and their children share 50% of their DNA. A father shares 50% of his DNA with his daughter. This is what 50% looks like in a chromosome browser. If we move on to first cousins, you could see that the amount of shared DNA drops off quite a bit. So these purple bars, in comparison to the purple bars from the previous slide, they represent the amount of DNA that first cousins share. So you can see that's a lot less than what we saw with the previous slide. And then moving on to second cousins, the drop-off continues, and it's a pretty rapid drop-off. So we can see that as the relationships become more distant, the amount of DNA shared becomes much less. And to give you some specific numbers, in this specific second cousin comparison, over 14,000 SNPs were compared, and over 14,000 SNPs were found to be matching, but that's out of 3 billion total base pairs in the genome. So it's a tiny fraction, an important and helpful and powerful fraction, but at the same time, a limited amount of information. So again, I want to emphasize over and over, genetic genealogy comparisons are very powerful, but at the same time, they're also very limited. We don't want to exaggerate the the power of what DNA testing can do. We really want to understand where we are with this. So moving back to the issues of privacy, I want to talk a little bit about informed consent. Informed consent is very tightly wound up in the issue of privacy. So I would say that there's a real problem generally in DNA testing with respect to informed consent. And I'll talk a bit about the informed consent agreement at AncestryDNA. AncestryDNA is a big player in DNA testing. They have an informed consent agreement. I've gone through that. It's difficult to read, actually, and I think that's a problem because we really want people who go into DNA testing to understand what they're getting into. But the informed consent agreement provided by AncestryDNA is pretty tough to get through. I brought up this topic in one of my DNA groups, and one of the first questions I got was, what does this all mean in terms a simple person can understand? And so that prompted me to take the text of the consent agreement and put it into a readability calculator to see how complicated is this really. And what I found is that the consent agreement is very difficult to read. The calculator gives it a Gunning Fog Index of 13.1. That's a high number. That means it's difficult. And in fact, the very first paragraph of the consent agreement comes in with a score of 17.2. So that's really almost off the charts. And that means that it is very difficult to read. An ideal readability score would be around 7 or 8. Anything above 12 is generally considered to be too hard for most people to read. By comparison, the Bible, Shakespeare, Mark Twain all have scores of around 6. The Wall Street Journal has a score of about 11. And of course, the Wall Street Journal isn't generally considered to be light reading. So when you're talking about a score of 17.2, you're talking about text that's very, very difficult to read. And so I think most people are probably getting to that first paragraph and they're getting completely bogged down and they're bailing out. And I know there are probably a lot of people who never even start reading it. But for those who really want to know and really are interested in trying to understand what they're getting themselves into, I think they're probably getting completely bogged down in the first paragraph. And that's unfortunate because there's a lot of important information after that first paragraph. However, in spite of this, I think that most people are signing the consent agreement. 23andMe says that about 80% of their customers are signing the consent agreement. We'll go through the consent agreement. I'll hit some highlights. I'll stick to the things that should be reasonably easy to understand. I think you have to read through the consent agreement more than once to really understand all of this. So I've done that, and I'll hit the highlights, and we'll talk about what I think it all means. So they start off saying that their consent agreement is part of a research study on human genetics, genealogy, etc. Sounds like good, lofty goals. You get a little further down into that, they say that the research may be performed by third-party researchers. So that's where we're getting into some important information. If you sign the consent agreement, you're not just agreeing to let Ancestry work with your data to learn things about genetics and health. You're also giving them permission to share and sell your genetic data and other data to third parties, but you're not getting specific information about who those third-party researchers are. Moving further, they say that your consent to participate in this research is completely voluntary, not required. You can sign up for AncestryDNA and get all of the features of AncestryDNA without signing the consent agreement. Unfortunately, this sentence is past that first paragraph that I think probably stops most people in their tracks. So I don't know that most people are seeing this portion of the consent agreement that says you don't even have to sign this in order to use AncestryDNA. But it's true. You do not have to sign the consent agreement in order to use AncestryDNA and have access to all of the features. So again, the consent agreement is not required, although the terms of service agreement is required. So there are two items that you're confronted with when you sign up for AncestryDNA and for other services like AncestryDNA. The terms of service agreement, that is required. The consent agreement is not required. Roberta Estes wrote a very good article about this years ago. I think it's just as relevant as it ever was. She says, I did agree to the terms of, I did agree to the terms and condition which are required, and my kit was activated. However, let me say right here, right now, you do not have to agree to the consent agreement to activate your kit, although it does not say that clearly on the sign-up page. And given where this box is placed, it certainly gives the impression that you need to click both of these boxes to activate the kit, but you don't. I did not agree to the consent agreement, Roberta Estes said. And I agree with all of that. I think these are very important points, and like her, I did not agree to the consent agreement. I rejected the consent agreement. I went to my Facebook group and I put out a survey, and I wanted to see how many people actually signed the consent agreement. Turns out that most people who responded to the survey didn't remember. They weren't sure whether they signed the consent agreement or not. A smaller number said they did sign the consent agreement. Some said no. A very small percentage said they agreed to the terms of service agreement but did not sign the consent agreement. I'd like to see more people in this category and fewer people in this category. If you do go through this process, I would hope that you at least remember what decision you made, and I would certainly encourage a lot of people to give serious consideration to agreeing to the terms of service, which is required, but holding off on the consent agreement, which is optional. And I think that the consent agreement, the way that it is written, really isn't acceptable. So moving down further through the consent agreement, there's a section entitled, what am I agreeing to if I consent? They say researchers may use all data that you provide to us when you use our services. So we're not just talking about DNA, we're talking about all data. Data includes the DNA derived from the saliva sample, of course, but also your family tree and other data that you provide when you register, create a profile, or use your account. So if you use your account, you're providing data and they're using that data as they see fit. And as an example, you might remember that at one point you put some information to create your profile page. And when you create your profile page, you're asked for a lot of information. Not everyone provides all of the information requested, but the requested information includes your name, your gender, age group, education, occupation, religion. So think about that when you think about signing a consent form. This data, this information can be bundled up with your genetic data and handed over to third parties for a profit. So you may be comfortable with that. If you are, fine, go ahead. If not, be careful to make the right decision when you sign up. They say what data is used. Additional data would include biosensor data recorded by mobile phones, activity trackers, health and wellness data collected from other devices. So that's a lot of information. I'm absolutely not happy providing all of that information to AncestryDNA to be sold with my genetic information. I would think that a lot of people would be hesitant to provide all of that information, but that is the kind of information that AncestryDNA intends to help themselves to if you do sign the consent agreement. We, AncestryDNA, may contact you from time to time to request additional information for the project, like a survey about your eye color or caffeine consumption or even a new DNA sample. So most of that sounds pretty superficial, not very serious, not a big deal, eye color, caffeine consumption. But to get a better idea of the kind of information that they would like to get from you in the form of surveys, I'll point out that there was a personal discoveries project that included several surveys that was rolled out a while back. I don't know if some people are still getting this. I haven't seen it in a while. But it asked a lot of very interesting questions. To be clear, the information that Ancestry collected with these surveys was intended to be used in their research project, which includes the genetic information. So they were clear about that, said your answers may be used in scientific research if you agreed to our informed consent. So if you agreed to the consent agreement, if you signed the consent agreement, you had already agreed to allow Ancestry to collect this information and use it as they see fit. So the Personal Discoveries Project, although it may have given the impression that it was designed to help you learn more about yourself, was really designed to help Ancestry learn more about you. Some people are comfortable with that, but some of the questions seemed pretty invasive to me. So we'll go through some of those. A few of the questions were not really invasive at all. They seemed pretty superficial. One question was, do you keep up with latest fashion trends? Another question was, what is your natural skin color? Again, fairly trivial, I think. But then there were more substantial questions. What is your marital status? On average, how many days a week do you spend with friends? So how much time are you spending with friends? What is your social life like? Do you have any phobias? What is your current employment status? A big number of options there, 10 options. How would you classify your current home? Do you live in a mobile home, a boat, a nursing home, a house? Detailed questioning there. Do you rent or do you own? Do you live in an urban situation? Do you live in a rural setting? How many children did you have? Did you ever serve in the military? Have you ever had high blood pressure? When did you get your first period? Are you postmenopausal? Clearly, I'm not the only person who feels like these questions cross the line. Ancestry provided the option to skip questions in the survey, and when you clicked to skip, they did indicate that they thought that perhaps they were getting into material that was really none of their business. So just keep that in mind. Ancestry is really interested in a lot of detail, and you may or may not be comfortable giving them a blank check to share this kind of information with government agencies, for-profit businesses, academic institutions. There's really no limit to the possibilities. And Ancestry really spells all of this out in that lengthy consent agreement that very few people read, I'm sure. They say that the research in their project may be performed by collaborators or collaborator partners. That sounds, again, very broad. It could be third parties and partners of the third party. So we're really getting further and further out on a limb in terms of how far this data can be disseminated. And to be perfectly clear, this is a revenue-generating enterprise. This is about making money. Ancestry says AncestryDNA receives compensation from collaborators who work on the project. So they share information and they get money for it. We really don't know. We have no way of knowing how Ancestry is disseminating this information, who they're giving it to, how many deals have been made. We just don't have access to that information. Ancestry is under no obligation to tell us this. But we do know that in at least one case, there was a deal with Google. They made a deal with Google. We don't know the financial terms. Financial terms have not been disclosed, but AncestryDNA made a deal with Calico. Calico is part of the Google family of companies. So moving further through the consent agreement, there's a section addressing specific risks Ancestry spells all of this out. They say that researchers outside of the U.S. may use your data. So as a U.S. citizen, you need to be aware that your data may cross international lines, may end up overseas. DNA samples could be transferred, and in that process, they could be lost or stolen. There could be a security breach, and so then your data could become public. And they do admit that third parties could end up identifying you from the research data that's disseminated. So that's just something to be aware of. And again, there are different comfort levels. Some people are perfectly fine with those possibilities. Excuse me. They mention in one section that when they share data and DNA, they remove your name, and they remove your contact information, and they remove other common identifying information. So they seem to indicate they're making an effort to provide some anonymity. Unfortunately, however, they make no guarantees about stripping away all of the information that you couple with your account and with your DNA. So again, remember, your profile page contains your name and your gender and your age and your employment and your religion potentially if you entered all of that information in. Ancestry is saying, well, we're going to take away your name and we're going to take away your contact information, but there's a lot of other information that could really narrow things down. 23andMe uses similar language. They say that they de-identify your genetic data. The question is, does this provide anonymity? And I think the answer is emphatically no. Linda Avey, co-founder of 23andMe, has explicitly admitted this. She says that it's a fallacy to think that genomic data can be fully anonymized. I think that's absolutely clear and becoming more clear all of the time. We'll get into that a little bit more. But a clear example of this is that adoptees and children who were conceived through sperm donation are every day finding family, identifying fathers by using services such as AncestryDNA or GEDmatch to find biological fathers, to find biological parents. They do this so routinely now, it really doesn't even grab our attention anymore. And that really clearly shows that not only can your DNA be used to identify you, but your relatives' DNA can be used to identify you. So anonymity is really a thing of the past as it relates to DNA and DNA testing. And we're seeing more and more people who have really come to see that this is clearly true. And I would go so far as to say that DNA data is ID. It is ID. It is identification. It's more powerful in many ways than photo ID or fingerprints or signatures or social security numbers. And I hope that if we've learned anything from the news, particularly the news of the Golden State Killer case, we've learned that DNA data is ID. I hope that we at least learned that one lesson. Again, this was an explosive story back in 2018. I did a survey in my Facebook group, and I asked people how they felt about it. The overwhelming #1 response is they were happy that the killer was caught. There were a lot of other responses. Most of those were positive. But again, I want to emphasize that this crime scene DNA helped to identify a killer, and it did so without his name, without his contact information, and without other identifying information. It was DNA match lists, family history analysis, looking at family trees, good old-fashioned research that genetic genealogists do every day, that adoption search angels do every day. And again, you can remember back, Ancestry and 23andMe and the other companies say, we'll share your DNA, but we'll do it without your name. We'll do it without your contact information. We'll do it without other identifying information. What we know now is that with all of that information stripped away, we can use DNA match results to identify the source of the DNA. So let's remember that we don't need names and contact information and other identifying information to identify people with DNA. With genetic genealogy, we don't need any of that. Those things do make it easier, but it's not necessary. So now we have a name. Crime scene DNA led to an arrest, and now the Golden State Killer has been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. So a very interesting case. I really think that it was cause for celebration. And I'm glad that we have this tool. And beyond that, I'm glad that we now can say, here is the potential. This is not just an abstract idea. We were beginning to see that these kinds of possibilities might come into existence. These possibilities might come into fruition. Now we know it's been done successfully, and I don't think we could have asked for a better case to illustrate the power of genetic genealogy and to really make things clear so that people can make their decision and say, I want to do DNA testing, I want to help with this kind of thing, I want to do my own research, I'm comfortable with this. Some people, however, have been frightened by this power. Although a lot of people see it as a good thing, some people are frightened. We can let people decide for themselves. However, in the wake of the Golden State Killer case, I think we're seeing some new myths crop up. So we mentioned earlier there were some assumptions that DNA testing that we do for genealogy could never be used for law enforcement purposes. That turned out to be false. I think we're seeing a new wave of falsehoods, a new wave of myths crop up, and I really want to try to shoot those down so that these myths don't provide a false sense of security that will lead to another wave of anxiety when we find out these reassuring myths are actually untrue. So I'm going to go through these and talk about how they're incorrect. I think we'll see very clearly that they're incorrect as we go forward. So one myth is that terms of service can keep law enforcement out of the DNA databases. That's absolutely incorrect, very clearly incorrect. Another myth is that there are technical obstacles that prevent law enforcement investigators out of some of the DNA databases. That is also incorrect. There is a myth regarding law enforcement potentially having special access to DNA and genetic information that is somehow different from the access that the rest of us have. We'll talk about how that's false. And another myth is that HIPAA regulations somehow have some bearing on any of this. For people who work in the healthcare industry, HIPAA regulations are very familiar. We'll talk about that a little bit. So the terms of service myth goes like this. It says the terms of service at the DNA testing companies prevent law enforcement investigators from using the DNA databases. This is absolutely incorrect. And this has been really clearly shot down by some smart people who really know what they're talking about and they know the law. So Matthew Feeney, policy analyst at the Cato Institute, wrote an article entitled Genetic Informants in the Hunt for the Golden State Killer. And in that article, he said the Golden State Killer investigation did not rely on investigators directly accessing GEDmatch customers' information. Rather, it relied on GEDmatch to do what its product is designed to do, find relatives. It's a good article. I recommend reading the whole thing. I think that was the most important quote. I sent an email back to him. I said, I would assume that law enforcement would not be particularly concerned about terms of service violations, but would there be any legal hurdles? Could law enforcement legally submit a crime scene DNA sample to Ancestry or 23andMe without permission from a court? Feeney responded to me and said the potential law enforcement violation of GEDmatch's terms of service in the Golden State Killer case is one of the interesting issues associated with the case. I believe that Orin Kerr, a law professor at USC Gould School of Law, is probably correct when he points out that police violating GEDmatch's terms of service probably did not violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, as that law makes an exception for law enforcement. I believe that a law enforcement agency could submit discarded DNA to 23andMe and or Ancestry without a court order, even if doing so would violate the terms of service. Feeney said, it would be hard to argue that you have a reasonable expectation of privacy to DNA when you leave it at a crime scene, and customers who volunteer their DNA to genealogical sites for the purpose of automated relative discovery hardly have a legitimate privacy complaint. After all, the police were not seeking their records. Rather, they were relying on GEDmatch's service to do what it advertises to its customers, DNA and genealogy research. So I went to some articles written by Orin Kerr, and I think those are also worth reading. He says that you can think of this as a kind of undercover operation in that the police were perhaps posing as the Golden State Killer, looking for family DNA matches. But that's not a Fourth Amendment issue, as police have always been allowed to do that under the Fourth Amendment. He goes on to say, at least right now, it seems to me that collecting evidence about a person who voluntarily submitted it to 1 million or so people and submitted that information with the goal of having it compared with another 1 million or so people is pretty unobjectionable. As a result, I think it falls into the category of good police work and not creepy overreach. And that was in an article entitled Tentative Thoughts on the Use of Genealogy Sites to Solve Crimes. It's a good article, and if you have an interest in this topic, it would be a good one to look at. I've put links to various articles in the PDF file that I created for this slideshow presentation, so I'll try to get that out for people so that they can follow these links. So again, I agree. I think this is pretty unobjectionable police work, and the bottom line is investigators use these databases the same way we do. They submit DNA and they look for matches, and they analyze those matches to put together family trees and figure out who the DNA came from. And police, in that they're using these databases the same way we do, are not using this information in some special way. They don't have special access. They're not digging deeper than you and I do. So this myth about police having special access to DNA, that's a myth that has really been busted. My view on this is that the police are basically crime scene search angels. When they're using DNA from crime scenes and using that DNA with family tree analysis, looking at matches and coming up with a family tree and identifying perpetrators by using genetic genealogy, they're basically functioning in a way that's very, very similar to the way that adoption search angels do their research. And so when police are using DNA and genetic genealogy, they're really functioning as crime scene search angels. That's my opinion. So we've had this kind of collision, two worlds, law enforcement and genealogy. Some people have really been excited about that. They're happy to see what's happening. It's very interesting, and they have no concerns at all. Other people are not comfortable with that, to say the least. But again, I think we're seeing some myths crop up that are giving some people some comfort. They don't want to think that law enforcement investigators really have the same access that you and I do, and so we're seeing people who are coming to the assumption that because AncestryDNA and 23andMe acquire your data through collecting saliva samples, you send in a saliva sample, they extract the DNA, and they analyze the DNA and they come up with a match list. Because saliva is part of this process, some people have come to conclude that crime scene DNA cannot be used at 23andMe or AncestryDNA because crime scene DNA is not DNA from fresh saliva; it's DNA from blood and other materials. It's a different bodily fluid. So people have come to the conclusion that 23andMe and AncestryDNA are essentially inaccessible to crime scene investigators. But I think that's very clearly incorrect. That assumption is poorly founded. I call this the myth of technical obstacles. I addressed this myth. I went onto Facebook and asked my friends about this. I said, I'm not convinced that getting crime scene DNA into the databases at 23andMe and Ancestry would be difficult at all. Any thoughts? One of the people who responded to me is a Facebook friend who runs a DNA testing lab, has a PhD from an elite European university. He essentially said, using crime scene DNA at AncestryDNA or 23andMe would be relatively easy. As long as the sample is a good sample, the DNA could be amplified by PCR, and the DNA that came out of that process could be used to simulate a saliva sample, no problem. And I think this is absolutely true. PCR is not really cutting-edge technology. It's being improved all of the time. So the PCR that we use today is better than the PCR that people were using years and years ago. But PCR has been around for quite a while now. Kary Mullis won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1993 for his contributions to the development of PCR. So PCR is not new. It's well-established technology, and it's easy to see how crime scene investigators could easily use this tool to simulate a saliva sample and send that in directly to 23andMe and Ancestry with little or no difficulty. And I would say I would be slightly surprised if they haven't already tried this. We really don't have any way of knowing. We may never know, may not know anytime soon anyway, unless this bubbles up in some court case. But I really don't see any barriers. So I think this is another myth that has been busted. If investigators in the United States have any qualms or reservations about using AncestryDNA, I'll say that I think that the rest of the world probably does not. It sounds like people in Sweden are really ready to move forward, and they're not going to hesitate. You can read about that. Finally, the final myth that I will talk about is the myth of HIPAA protections. People who work in healthcare are very familiar with HIPAA. HIPAA regulations basically put limitations on how medically relevant data can be shared and spread around. Excuse me. Many people have come to assume that because DNA tests have some medical relevance, HIPAA regulations would limit the use of DNA and would limit the extent to which genetic information can be shared or sold. I always had doubts about whether HIPAA had any relevance at all. Ancestry has addressed this very clearly now. They put out a privacy statement very recently, within the past couple of weeks, and they very clearly said HIPAA provides no protection at AncestryDNA. It's irrelevant. HIPAA regulations don't apply to companies such as 23andMe or AncestryDNA. So a few closing thoughts. I think that we've learned a lot over the last 2 or 3 years about privacy and DNA. One thing that I would urge people to do is to be careful about initial reactions to headlines. The news headlines are often inaccurate and misleading, and so we should be slow to react to these headlines. Let's be cautious. I think GEDmatch has been unfairly blamed for the anxiety that people have had with respect to some of these high-profile cases. First of all, I don't think anybody's been harmed. I think people have been helped. It's good to put bad people behind bars. I've seen a lot of good, but there has been a lot of anxiety. And GEDmatch is a small company. They don't have deep pockets. They don't have the money to do a lot of symbolic fighting in the court. I think that attempts to fight this technology and to keep law enforcement from using this kind of technology the same way that adoption search angels use it is futile. I don't think that courts are going to say that law enforcement agencies have fewer rights than adoption search angels. I think that if we're going to keep law enforcement out of the genealogy databases, there are going to have to be new laws, and I just don't see that coming very quickly. So let's not blame the little companies that are trying to help genealogists do their work. They really don't have any power to stop this. Legislators might have the power to stop it, but GEDmatch doesn't have the power to stop it. These companies really can't do much. So let's be careful about scapegoating people who are caught in the middle of this. My strongest recommendation, if you're really worried about genetic privacy, you want to do the best you can to protect your own genetic privacy and still go ahead with testing, I would say opt out of all of the consent agreements at all of the DNA testing companies. Go with the most conservative option that you can find. Don't allow these companies to share your data far and wide. Tap on the brakes, tell them, okay, you know, I have to agree to your terms of service so that I can get your service, but I'm not going to, I'll give you a blank check to sell my data or share it with just anybody. I think that if these DNA testing companies are going to be sharing and selling data to third parties, it really should be on a case-by-case basis. So they should have to come to you and say, hey, we're interested in doing some research with Google. We want to sell some of the data to Google. Is this okay with you? You say yes or no. But that's not how this works. That's not how this is configured at this point. At this point, the DNA testing companies are saying, just give us permission to do whatever with whoever. And I think that's just too broad. I don't think that that's appropriate. And I think that that's a way, opting out of all of that is a way to say, I want you to be careful. I don't want to have my DNA all over the place. So that would be my recommendation. I've opted out at all of the DNA companies. I'm not really comfortable giving a blank check to everybody for anything that they might want to do. So another piece of advice, stay up to date. These things are always changing. I would say go ahead and read the privacy statement that it was updated at Ancestry on the 23rd of September. We've got some fresh information to comb through. Take a look at that. Finally, thanks again for having me again. I really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, please email me at jxleefam@gmail.com, jxleefam@gmail.com. Thank you.